Jerusalem. This great city is sacred to three of the world's major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The foundation of Judaism and Christianity is the Old Testament. Its stories are also important in Islam. This document has thus been hugely influential in shaping both the Middle East. Many people believe every word of the Old Testament is literally true. Even today, this conviction is fueling arguments over issues from evolution to homosexuality to abortion. The potency of these conflicts makes it important to know how much and what in the Old Testament can really be taken as literal truth. Two men are trying to shed light on these questions by investigating the archaeological evidence. What they've discovered has sparked tremendous controversy and will revolutionize our understanding of the Bible. So today we reveal the secrets of the Old Testament. In recent decades, biblical archaeology has undergone something of a revolution. A more scientific approach has informed a younger generation of archaeologists. And changing circumstances in the Middle East have allowed important new excavations, which have brought additional evidence to light. Against this background, a book called The Bible Unearthed has proposed a radical new history of the Israelites and the Bible, and powerfully challenged traditional archaeology. Its authors are Israel Finkelstein, Professor of Archaeology at Tel Aviv University, and Neil Silberman, Director of the Ename Center of Public Archaeology in Belgium.
100 years ago, when archaeologists came to a site and would find a piece of pottery like this, they would try to fit it in somewhere in the biblical story, seeing this as a symbol of the time of Joshua or the time of Amos or another character. We work in an entirely different way. For us, the evidence is the first bit of information. We construct a story of the rise of civilization in this country. And then, in fact, we see the Bible and the biblical literature and the biblical memories as somehow symbolic of the very basic changes in society that we see here.
For the first time, we have this information not only about the main sites, but also about the countryside. The surveys in the highlands and other parts of the country have completely revolutionized what we know about ancient people in this country. And on top of that, the change of archaeology from, the old traditional way to more scientific archaeology with all sorts of sciences supporting what we are doing and providing us with wonderful information about the daily life, about what people ate, about the environment, about how they exploited the different ecological niches and so on.
And I think that it's important to understand that the Bible, of course, is one of our most important ancient Near Eastern texts. But it's got a larger significance than that, obviously. At a time in the world where people are tending to use the Bible in a very literal sense for all kinds of rhetorical, political reasons, using the Bible as it is written, it's very important. But what we hope to do is to share the information that has been collected for the first time with the public to perhaps create a very more complex understanding of what the Bible is and what it actually says, and perhaps at least cause people to understand that there's a lot more to the biblical history than just occasional quotations used for very tactical religious, political purposes.
The Old Testament tells the story of the Jews' ancestors, the Israelites. It says their history began with a family of nomads who migrated down from Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, to Canaan, modern Israel. Their leader was a man called Abraham.
The Lord said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee.
That land was Canaan. And according to the Old Testament, God promised it to Abraham and his descendants forever. This is the origin of the idea of the Promised Land. For the best part of a century, archaeologists have tried to prove the Abraham story by finding evidence of appropriate migrations at the times suggested by the biblical account.
All this theory from A to Z of a migration from the north is not accepted anymore today. I mean, it was a nice theory, but there's no backing. I mean, the people of the beginning of the second millennium BC, they are all from a local stock. So there was no migration from the north that you can relate Abraham to.
The general portrayal of nomadic life in the Bible doesn't really reflect very strongly what we know about nomads. Nomads are often plunderers. They often invade settled territories. There's reference to camels. The camel nomads come in much later. They are not characteristic of this period.
After arriving in Canaan, Abraham and his family supposedly settled here in the city of Hebron. This building, the tomb of the patriarchs built by King Herod 2,000 years ago in Roman times, is supposed to stand above their burial site.
What we can see here, the main building is Roman, from the Roman period, probably Herodian. You see the big stones. Above them are much later Muslim mosque. But what is most important for our aim here is the bedrock here. This is the natural bedrock from the time of the Canaanite period, from the time of the settlement period, and so on. And in this bedrock, you cannot see it here, but all around, in this bedrock, were cut tombs during the Canaanite period. This was the cemetery of the town, here around. So this is the source of the tradition, which is not historical, about the patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they are so-called buried here.
So do we have any actual evidence that Abraham and his family did at least exist?
There is no historical Abraham in the strict sense. There are traditions about Abraham. What we read in the Bible are later traditions which have almost nothing to do with real history. Probably there was an ancestor of the tribes here named Abraham, but we know nothing about him but his name.
The patriarchs could have been real figures who became mythical during the ages. They could have been completely mythical. We don't know, and we'll probably never know. In fact, there's no way to know.
We've come to a complete archaeological dead end about Abraham. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Abraham was a historical figure. But he is a prominent character in the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis is an ancient text that is, of course, of incredible importance for us. And what we see in the figure of Abraham is a symbolic representation of the birth of the nation. Because at the time of the writing of the Bible, the history of the people of Israel was not considered to be history in the sense that we understand it, of years, of periods, of particular historical events. It was seen more as the history of a family. And of course, the father of the family, the founder of the family, is a person of great significance.
Although we can appreciate the importance of a mythical figure like Abraham, the complete absence of any objective evidence, indeed the inconsistencies in the biblical account, inevitably weakens the claims made for it. But what about other Old Testament heroes, like Moses, who brought us the laws on which so many of our basic moral ideas are founded? Can Professor Finkelstein and Neil Silberman find any hard evidence that he at least existed? According to the Bible, famine drove Abraham's descendants away from Canaan to Egypt, where they ended up as slaves in the Nile Delta. after many tribulations, a leader amongst them, a man called Moses, led them out of Egypt. They headed eastwards, back towards Canaan, the promised land. This famous journey forms the basis of the Old Testament books of Exodus and Numbers.
And it came to pass that the Lord did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt.
Well, here we have the early...
Neil Silberman has come to discuss the evidence for the Exodus with Donald Redford, one of the world's leading archaeological experts on Egypt's Delta region.
Some kind of food preparation.
We know from the archaeological monuments and the inscriptions that in the 13th century there was tremendous power in the Egyptian empire. How can you explain the possibility of such a large group as described in the Exodus story actually going out of Egypt? Is that possible?
Well, I couldn't explain it if I subscribe to that theory. What you said is quite correct. Egypt, in fact, for 5 centuries, from the 15th century on, Egypt ruled an empire, the largest at that time, which extended 2,000 miles as the crow flies from a little north of Khartoum all the way to near the Euphrates River. And the Egyptian army and occupation forces and its economy were extremely strong. They held all of Canaan, of course. Their sphere of influence extended to the Greek islands and Crete. And there is no indication whatsoever in the records, either archaeological or written, of any major hiatus, such as would have been created by the expulsion of upwards of 2 million people, if we believe the biblical record. That would have made such a hole in the population. It would have brought the economy to a standstill. It would certainly have turned up in the record somewhere. Now, that's an argument from silence, I understand, but nevertheless, the silence is absolutely watertight. There is no indication whatsoever.
The Bible also says that after leaving Egypt, Moses and the Israelites wandered for 40 years through the Sinai desert on their way back to Canaan. It was here that Moses received 2 tablets of stone bearing the famous 10 Commandments, which still today include some of our most basic moral norms. This is also where the Israelites apparently agreed to give up the worship of idols for the worship of God, and just the one God, alone. But could such a journey have been at all feasible?
All over the eastern delta and in the Sinai and up in the Negev and further north, there were permanent Egyptian garrisons and garrison points, checkpoints. And we have records, the letters that were sent back and the reports of such police on the comings and goings of wandering peoples. Certainly, there would have been no chance whatsoever for a group of people that large to move freely through the desert and into the Negev. Not a chance at all. Moreover, that would be the height of folly to go south into that inhospitable, barren land with mountains everywhere and little water and less food supply. The story simply doesn't fit in so many ways.
And there's an even bigger problem. Throughout the entire period in which the Bible places the Exodus, Canaan was in fact an Egyptian province, ruled by Egyptian governors. We know this because we have extensive Egyptian records from Canaan and a wealth of archaeological evidence. This is Bet Sha'an in Israel. Beneath these Roman ruins, archaeologists discovered it had been a powerful Egyptian garrison in biblical times.
It signifies Egyptian control over Canaan in the late Bronze Age. If you want to understand the way the Egyptians dominated completely the country and the countryside, you have to come here. There was a strong garrison, there were scribes here, there were soldiers here, there were administrators here, and everything was under the control of the Egyptians, which means that 20 kilometers from here, 30 kilometers from here, if somebody wanted to take some sort of a major economic decision or a major political decision, he needed to come to Bet Sha'an to get the approval of the Egyptians. They were the masters of the countryside.
So it makes no historic sense for Moses to have led the Israelites to Canaan in order to escape the Egyptians. But what about Moses himself? Surely there must be some evidence for this most famous Old Testament hero, perhaps the most famous of all Old Testament figures. Even if there's no evidence of the Exodus, there must surely be some record of a leader as important as him.
The name Moses is a name which is very popular from early periods right down into late periods. So it's a fairly common Egyptian name. That's all that we can say. There is no text in which we can identify this Moses or that Moses as the Moses.
The question of the historicity of Moses is the same as the question of the historicity of Abraham. That is to say, maybe there was a figure, maybe there was a leader. I am not here to undermine the historicity of Moses. I think that it is possible, but I would say it's beyond recovery.
Perhaps the best way to make sense of the story of Moses and the Exodus is to understand that there was constant movement between Canaan and Egypt in ancient times.
We can't be sure if there was one incident in the hundreds of years that Canaanites came down to Egypt that more or less represents what we have in the story of the Exodus. But the experience of going down to Exodus, of being involved in Egyptian civilization, of freeing themselves from the rule of the Pharaoh, happened again and again.
This is Mount Nebo in Jordan. From here, according to the Bible, Moses looked down on the promised land of Canaan, but died before he could enter it. It fell to Joshua, apparently, to lead the Israelites across the valley and to take Canaan by military conquest.
Then Joshua commanded the people, saying, "Within 3 days ye shall pass over this Jordan, to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God giveth you."
And it's a wonderful story, a great saga of war and conquest and bravery and miracles. And the question is, did it happen? Did it really happen the way it is described in the text of the Bible, of the book of Joshua?
The Bible says Joshua and the Israelites embarked on a 7-year campaign during which they conquered 30 Canaanite cities. Without doubt, the most famous story is that of Jericho.
The priests blew with the trumpets, and the people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat, so that the people took the city.
In fact, distinguished British archaeologist Dame Kathleen Kenyon established 50 years ago that the walls of Jericho were destroyed many centuries before Joshua's time, probably by earthquakes, and that there was virtually nothing there in the conquest era.
The conclusion is, when we look at Jericho, Jericho was not inhabited in the 13th century BC probably. And then anyway, there are no fortifications. So where are the big walls of Jericho? I mean, you have this wonderful description of the people of Israel going, with the Ark of the Covenant, with the trumpets, and then the walls of Jericho collapse, in the 7th day. All of a sudden, there's nothing there. So this is not history in the simple sense, and the case of Jericho applies also for other places mentioned in the tradition of the conquest in the book of Joshua. Many of the cities mentioned were not inhabited at all in the land.
Stein and Silberman. One of the cities mentioned in the Bible as having been conquered by Joshua and the Israelites was inhabited and was destroyed at the appropriate time. It's Hatzor in northern Israel, and Professor Amon Ben-Tor is in charge of excavating it.
Look at that. That's the destruction of the entire palace. If you look over there, We go towards the southern wall. We find ourselves in the throne room of the palace. So we are in the throne room. Look at the cracked basalt stones. Look at this. Normal heat doesn't do this. Only a very, very intense fire. Look at what is happening on the walls. See the ashes, see the wood, signs of the timber here on the walls. Wherever you look, wherever you go, same signs of destruction. In the case of Chatzor, we see undoubtedly a violent destruction, like in no other place. And the question which faces us is, when did it happen and who did it? I believe that by now we can say rather safely that the destruction of Chatzor, the big final destruction of Chatzor, occurred sometime in the first half or towards the middle of the 13th century BC. And the question is, who is responsible?
The destruction of Hatzor coincides with a period of great turbulence in the Middle East. This is the temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt. At this time, mysterious people who came from the sea and are known as the Sea People attacked Egypt and many parts of the Egyptian Empire. They also attacked Canaan. Later, they settled on its coast and are known in the Bible as the Philistines.
There was a collapse of the Canaanite system and Egyptian administration in Canaan. It didn't come, in one overnight. It was a long process, which probably took almost a century, from the beginning, from the collapse of the first cities to the later ones. And much of it must have been done, or must have been related to the assault of the Sea People in several waves, possibly, on the coasts of Canaan. So slowly by slowly, the cities of Canaan disappeared. Some of them must have been destroyed by Sea People in the 12th century. Some of them could have been destroyed by reaction of Egypt. Some of them could have been destroyed by rivalry between fighting each other. Some of them could have been taken by those groups on the margin of the Canaanite society.
Professor Ben-Tor believes that such a group did destroy Hatzor, and that since the Bible names them as the Israelites, why disbelieve it?
Nowhere in any document in Egypt does it say that the Egyptians destroyed Chatzor. So I think we can rule out the Egyptians. Let's go back to the Canaanite city-states. Which one of the Canaanite city-states was big enough to compete with Chatzor? Which one could have destroyed Chatzor? I don't know of any such city-state. I'll rule them out. Let's go to the Sea People. They have a very, very distinct pottery. We did not find even one shirt which is Philistine. Not one. Add to this the fact that it is too far inland. The Sea People were coastal. This is where their interests were. Not so far inland as Chatzor. I'd also rule them out. It turns out that we are left with those enigmatic Israelites or proto-Israelites. They were the ones responsible for Chatzor, and that the traditions that are preserved hundreds of years later in the book of Joshua have a nucleus in the reality of the destruction of Chatzor.
So it might have been the early Israelites who destroyed Hatzor. But that one fact hardly vindicates the whole Old Testament account of the conquest. So why did the story come to be composed in this form?
The way the story is written, putting the conquest of the Promised Land into a single military campaign with a unified strategy to conquer the center of the country, the north and the south, is clearly a later attempt to explain how the Israelites conquered the Promised Land.
As one might expect, the conclusions of archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein arouse fierce controversy, even within the archaeological profession.
If the Rahov dates are correct.
Here, Professor Finkelstein is in Los Angeles, taking part in a heated debate.
All kinds of retelling and editorializing and writing.
A major issue currently dividing archaeologists is the Old Testament portrayal of what happened after the conquest.
Larry, don't talk, it's my turn. And we have a...
The Bible says that once the Israelites had established themselves in Canaan, a great empire eventually arose over all their people. This unified empire was supposedly established in the 10th century BC by David, he of David and Goliath fame. His capital was at Jerusalem, which is why it's known as Royal David's City. And after King David's death, he was apparently succeeded by his son, Solomon. The heroic biblical portrayal of this dynasty has always made it seem a kind of golden age for the Israelites. For once, as far as David is concerned, we can actually say with confidence whether he was real or not. A stele is a stone tablet bearing an inscription. In 1993, archaeologists excavating here at Tel Dan, a northern outpost of the Israelite kingdom, found a fragment of a foreign Aramaic stele from the 9th century BC, which refers to King David by name.
When you look at what is written there, in the 9th row, 1, 2, 4, 6 of the letters make up the name which can be read Bet David. It's the first time that the name of Bet David, or David, as the father of the kingdom of Judah, is mentioned in a source which is extra-biblical, not something that was written by the Bible author, but something from the 9th century BC. And it's the first time that the name David is mentioned. It's unique, and it tells you that it could be that David was an historical figure, or at least people in the 9th century thought of him as their founder of their kingdom.
So it seems David was a real person. The Bible says that his capital was Jerusalem. It mentions large armies and important public buildings. But Professor Finkelstein is skeptical of this portrayal, because present-day archaeology doesn't support any idea of Jerusalem being a big city at that time. Ronnie Reich is currently excavating the site of 10th century BC Jerusalem.
A pocket here, a pocket there, maybe in other places which Kenyon has found. But for this particular period is not yet enough to say even, I think, the nature of the site. Is it a huge urban city? It is definitely not.
In the ancient part of Jerusalem, there's a curious stepped structure. Some archaeologists think this might have been part of David's fortifications.
In my view, David's Jerusalem was a kind of a citadel city. It doesn't mean that he had a huge city around him. The city was quite small, but he probably gained a lot of political power and somehow succeeded to control the entire country in a time when there was a gap, there was a kind of a vacuum, political vacuum in this country. There was no Egyptian empire anymore. The Canaanites were very poor, and probably he took advantage of this situation.
But even this modest view of Jerusalem is hard to reconcile with the archaeology. Ronnie Reich and Professor Finkelstein are descending into the bowels of the city. It seems Jerusalem at the time of King David was only sparsely inhabited.
So much has been excavated here in the area, and nothing has been found, no stones, large stones of, let's say, 10th century, no pottery. Pottery which is found everywhere, and if people were active in this place, they might have left something behind, must have left something behind, so that here the negative results again and again and again simply prove the point.
The idea of a great Davidic or Solomonic empire in the 10th century BC is absolutely ridiculous, because an empire needs a capital. There's almost nothing in Jerusalem, a very small village. An empire needs manpower. There's nothing in Judah, a few small villages. An empire needs administration. There's no administration, there's no scribal activity. Where is the empire?
Many archaeologists remain unpersuaded by Professor Finkelstein. They point to David's son, Solomon. He is famous in the Bible for his wisdom and judgment, and for having been the builder of the first great Israelite cities.
And this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised, for to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hatzor, and Megiddo, and Gezer.
The Bible mentions Hatzor as one of the cities Solomon built. The Canaanite city was indeed rebuilt in the 10th century BC, and Professor Ben-Tor can see no reason to doubt that it was Solomon's work.
How can we be sure, and I'm talking only about Hatzor now, how can we be sure that this fortification, that this gate were built by Solomon? We cannot be sure. There is no building inscription said, I, Solomon, built this building. But what we can be sure of, and we checked it again and again and again, by means of stratigraphy, by means of pottery typology, we can be sure that these were built in the 10th century. And since the Bible tells us that it was Solomon, now you don't have to ask me, how can I tell that it was Solomon? It's common sense. If you want to say it is not Solomon, it's you. You tell me why it is not Solomon.
Traditional archaeology also supported the idea of Solomon as a great builder, because at the two other sites mentioned in the Old Testament, Gezer and Megiddo, they found characteristic six-chambered gates, just as at Hatzor. This was taken as evidence of a common Solomonic origin.
What you see now is the famous six rooms gate at, here in Gezer, the so-called Solomonic gate. It's hard to see because of all the vegetation and everything, but you can still see the main pass in the middle, and then 1, 2, 3 rooms to one side, and 1, 2, 3 rooms to the other side. You still see the beautifully worked stones at the entrance. There is a similar gate in Hatzor, and there is a similar gate in Megiddo. And these three gates were thought to be, because of the passage in the Book of Kings, these three gates were thought to be the gates that Solomon built, the blueprint of the Solomonic architecture. It doesn't fit because there are gates like that also in other sites, which are not Solomonic in any way. Ashdod, it's a Philistine city. Tel Batash, it's on the border between Philistine and Israel. There's a later gate in Lachish. So it's like, let's say, it's more like a fashion of the Iron Age gates than something that single out Solomonic building.
This is the similar monumental six-chambered gate in Megiddo, found in the 1930s and also assumed to be Solomonic. On the basis of the archaeology, we can tell that the Israelite palace which stood here was quite an elaborate and sophisticated building. Now, modern radiocarbon dating tests are being conducted to try and establish the exact date of the palace. The results of the tests are not conclusive, but they point strongly to a date about a century after Solomon.
This is the new data together with the old data. And the one thing you can see is that the new data is consistent with the previous one. So we didn't change the picture, and that's great, because you don't want each time a new data comes, the picture to be changed completely. And moreover, it supports the picture, because this red point, which is the new one you just brought here, is nicely consistent with the low chronology and fairly far away from the high chronology. So objectively, that's what we expect. So great. I think it's fine.
The low chronology, pointing well after the 10th century BC, makes Professor Finkelstein and Neil Silberman doubt whether a great empire could have existed at that time.
Look, It was a wonderful story. It got people excited and really interested in the Bible, but we just can't accept the story of the Solomon's Gates anymore.
For many reasons. First of all, right there from the beginning, there was a problem. Because when you look at the report, at the archaeological facts on the ground, the gate is definitely later. It must be put somewhere in the 8th century or something like that. But beyond that, today we know that there are gates like this all over, later than the 10th century, in the 8th century, and even in the 7th century, and beyond the borders of biblical Israel.
But some archaeologists think there may well be something in the biblical account. This is Thebes in Egypt. The great temple of Karnak records the history of the pharaohs and of the great Egyptian dynasties. One of these inscriptions refers to the military exploits of a pharaoh called Sheshonq I. It details the blistering devastation that he visited on 150 towns and villages in Canaan in the 10th century, the supposed Solomonic era. Uniquely for an Egyptian campaign in Canaan, Sheshonq's forces turned inland from the coast and attacked towards the highlands where Jerusalem is situated.
We have to ask ourselves what is the reason for such a pharaoh in the 10th century BC to invade the central mountains, the hills, which were forested and were hard terrain to reach for a military campaign, Egyptian military campaign. I think that this is a good hint that there was some political entity in this region. And this political entity, in my view, can be identified with this united monarchy, which probably threatened the Egyptians, or they saw in it some kind of threat, political threat or economic threat.
So the evidence, archaeological and textual, provides a very contradictory picture of 10th century Canaan. There may have been some kind of Israelite entity, but it seems highly improbable that it could have been the elaborate empire portrayed in the Bible.
It's confusing. The highlands of the south are very sparsely settled. There's no manpower for great Davidic conquests. In Jerusalem, it's a small village, nothing monumental, no real evidence for big capital.
Despite the biblical evidence.
Of course, no evidence for a great Solomonic capital ruling over a great state, rich state, and so on. And here at Megiddo, the buildings, the monumental buildings which had been described as the symbol of Solomonic greatness, in fact, date a bit later. They don't date to the time of Solomon, they don't date to the 10th century. So we are in a situation of a complete negative picture, negative evidence from coast to coast.
So what had been connected with Solomon and used as an illustration of his greatness is later, and we have to rethink the whole situation.
Yeah, we do.
It seems some of the early Old Testament stories may contain glimmers of real history, so they're unlikely to have been simply made up and invented. Equally, many key events cannot have happened the way it says they did. So how do we make sense of this unevenness? Israel Finkelstein has come here to San Diego to discuss this with one of the world's leading authorities on the Old Testament, Professor Richard Friedman.
The situation with the Bible is not just that it's a very old book, but there's a tremendous difference from the oldest part of the Bible to the youngest part of the Bible. So the first sentence in the Bible, whatever that is, was written 1,000 years before the last sentence in the Bible. And in between, there's maybe 100 or 150 authors living in this century, this century, this century. And so even when you know Hebrew, you learn it's a different Hebrew all the way through it. Even when you think you understand one of the authors of the Bible, but there's another author of the Bible who sees things differently. So people say it's not a book, it's books. It's not a book, it's a literature, it's a library. People use all these metaphors to try to capture the idea that the Bible is this amazing collection over so much time.
Professor Friedman is passionate that we need to know the Bible's origins in order to understand the way it portrays history.
If you can know where the book came from, who the author was, why it made a difference, then you understand how it came up with the particular conceptions of God that it did, why it came out telling history the way it did. It's everything that we think is so great about the Bible. We try to find out through this search, why is it so great? How did we get this book?
Archaeology and science can now, for the first time, begin providing the answer. It's a largely new and unfamiliar story, markedly at odds with the Bible's own account. But why should we want to unravel the story of the Israelites and their Bible? Because they invented the idea of a single God. Because they invented written history. Because they invented the idea of the individual with rights and responsibilities that lies at the heart of Western civilization. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we all owe an immeasurable debt to that impossibly distant group of people. So who were they actually? How did the Bible come to be written? And how did they bequeath us this extraordinary legacy? As we've seen, contrary to the Old Testament, there's no evidence for any migration from Mesopotamia at the supposed time of Abraham, said to be the Israelites' founding patriarch. We can't rule out the possibility that some nomads may have come to Canaan. But modern archaeology suggests that rather than being outsiders, the people who later became the Israelites were simply part of the pre-existing Bronze Age population of Canaan.
The people of the beginning of the second millennium BC, Middle Bronze Age, and also the people of the Intermediate Bronze Age in the third millennium, late third millennium BC are all from a local stock. So there was no migration from the north that you can relate Abraham to.
In effect, the Israelites appear to have simply emerged out of the local population. When is difficult to say precisely. What we do know is that throughout the Bronze Age, that is up until about the 13th to 12th century BC, the land of Canaan consisted of a number of Canaanite city-states. Though Egypt ruled the whole territory, the city-states enjoyed considerable self-government.
City-state is a term that we use for the political organization of this country during the Canaanite period. The country was divided into about 30 city-states. This is quite a small country. Each state had a territory of about approximately 1,000 square kilometers, and each city-state capital had a local kind of king, a petty king we may call it, small king. He had a palace, he had his courtiers around him, and some noblemen and so on. There was some hierarchy in the city, the craftsmen, the priests, and the common people. And he had a group of small towns and villages in his territory. So this organization of city-state is very common in the Levant, in Palestine, in Syria, during the Bronze Age.
The Egyptian control of Canaan lasted about 300 years. But the attack of the Sea People from the late 13th century BC, which led to the collapse of Egyptian rule and the slow destruction of the Canaanite city-states, unleashed tremendous regional instability.
The entire Eastern Mediterranean was in a complete turmoil. The economy was disrupted. Maritime trade routes were cut. Ports on the Mediterranean coast were destroyed, were attacked and taken. In a situation like this of economy falling, famine, political dysfunction, then one city can attack another. A gang of people from the highlands can take a city. Pastoral nomads can come also and try to gain some advantage by attacking a single city, isolated city. Everything was in chaos.
No one really knows why this happened. But out of the anarchy, destruction, and dislocation came a development which was to have the most profound consequences for the whole Western world. It was nothing more extraordinary than that poor, backward and illiterate desert nomads were forced to start farming in this unpromising terrain. But in time, this particular group of people were to achieve something remarkable, to establish kingdoms and a scripture, and to invent the idea of a single God. These poor, backward, illiterate nomads became the Israelites. Desert life has changed little over thousands of years. In ancient Canaan, as in modern Jordan, nomads survived by trading and buying grain from small village farmers at the edges of the desert.
The pastoral nomads had herds and could sell the products of the herds to the farmers. However, they needed surplus of grain for the farmers. So as long as the farmers in the villages could produce enough surplus of grain to give to the pastoral nomads in exchange for the products of the herds, everything went on very well. Remember that in the last phase of the Late Bronze Age, we are entering a major crisis in the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Canaan, the neighboring countries, empires collapse, the Egyptian administration is gone from Canaan, city-states are put in fire, villagers are running away because of the sea people, because of other reasons. There is a complete turmoil throughout the land. And they cannot produce, the villagers, enough surplus of grain in order to maintain this exchange with the pastoral nomads. And the pastoral nomads they find themselves in a deep crisis as well.
It was this economic catastrophe which probably drove desert nomads at the end of the Bronze Age to start primitive settlements in nearby hills on the west bank of the River Jordan. They were the first Israelites.
We discovered here in this country since the beginning of the 70s or after the 6 Days War, hundreds of sites throughout the central hill country of Israel. We have these settlements, these villages, built right on bedrock in areas which were not settled at all by the Canaanites in the second millennium BC, in the late Bronze Age at least. They are very simple villages. They are not fortified usually, except maybe a fence that surround the village. We find animal pens, for example. At Gilo we found large animal pens which are used by these people. So I think that here we have an emergence of something new, which can be related to the emergence of those Israelites.
From the extensive archaeological surveys of the last 30 years, Professor Finkelstein and his colleagues can now draw a detailed map of the earliest Israelite settlement patterns.
Okay. This map gives you, in a graphic way, the final results of all the surveys of many years in the highlands from south to north. That is to say, you can see that there are areas like here in the south that have less sites. The number of sites to the south of Jerusalem is very limited. And for instance, in the north, around Shechem and farther to the north, where you have bigger valleys, you have more sites. I can tell you from my knowledge of the landscape of the highlands that over there, the only possibility and the only reason to enter these parts of the highlands is in order to grow olives and produce olive oil.
Olive oil. It seems an unlikely agent of radical change. But soon the early Israelites were producing a surplus, and a surplus meant trade.
This is a courtyard of a normal dwelling of that period. In the courtyard, all kinds of activities took place, among them olive oil production. What we have here is an olive oil press. The crushed olives are put into the baskets. Once the baskets are full of the crushed olives, the boom stands something like this, and then the pressure applied to it by these weights, which by the way are the original weights, pushes the boom down slowly, gradually. It's not happening in minutes, it takes hours, and the olive oil runs out of the baskets into this little drainage pipe here into the juglets. Such an olive oil press is definitely much too big for one family that lived here. This is a production, let's say a major production for export or to be sold somewhere in the country or even beyond.
The well-watered valleys of the Northern Highlands ran down to the coast, and so geography encouraged trade and prosperity. In due course, a more complex society arose.
The population grows. There's hierarchy between the settlements. There's intensification of the agricultural activity. There is industrialization of the agricultural output. There is specialization in grain growing and olive oil production. All this shows that we are on the way to statehood. There's this development which leads to statehood, and all this happens in the north.
Slowly, but unmistakably, this northern area became a recognizable kingdom. It was called Israel. This was the Israelite city of Megiddo. From this period on, we can be fairly confident about events. The Bible itself probably began to be compiled quite close to this period, so it's more reliable. We have detailed diplomatic records from neighboring territories like Assyria. And we now find far more material facts on the ground.
Concerning Israel, we have very interesting archaeological evidence and very convincing archaeological evidence for the development of the kingdom. Samaria, the capital, is founded in the 9th century. The same in Jezreel, the other palace. All this confirms the Bible very well, because the Bible tells us that Omri founded Samaria and Ahab built also Samaria as well as Jezreel. So concerning the northern kingdom, Tel Dan, Megiddo, Hatzor, Tel Rehov, all these sites really give us a beautiful picture.
And so the northern kingdom of Israel grew apace. Former Canaanite cities destroyed in the Great Chaos were now rebuilt as Israelite centers. But in the southern highlands, it was a different story. This area was known as Judah, and it was here that Jerusalem was located. But one can see, even today, that this terrain was much less promising than in the northern kingdom of Israel.
As you can see all around, it's a highland area. It's the highest in the central highland of Israel. It's the most remote area. It's the poorest area. Not too much rain, not too much good field for agriculture. There are, but less than in the north.
In the 10th century, the south is still very sparsely settled by just a few small villages. And Jerusalem itself is only a God-forsaken, small and remote village. There's almost nothing there.
But despite their differences, the people of both Israel and Judah were one and the same.
In the north, the much richer area with a richer environment, with cities, with trade routes, it naturally became a powerful kingdom. That's the kingdom of Israel. In the south, centered around Jerusalem, was a kingdom based on the same principles, but because of its environment, because of its low population, it was much economically weaker. It was more isolated. And yet the two kingdoms had a relationship. They sprang from the same origins, from the same historical period.
The Bible tells us that from the time of Moses, several centuries before, the Jews were monotheistic, worshipping only one God. The Israelites in both the northern and the southern kingdom did share a common religion, but it wasn't monotheism.
We know from text and from archaeology that traditional Israelite religion involved venerating the ancestors, the gods of the underworld, so to speak. We know from texts, at least, and from iconography that we find in the ground, that traditional Israelite religion involved venerating the stars and the planets. We know, therefore, that traditional Israelite religion was polytheistic.
We know that in the Canaanite and Israelite tradition, mountains were very important in the cult. There were gods who are related to mountains. Baal, the Baal of Carmel, the Baal of Hermon, the Baal of Tzafon, and so on. And perhaps this tradition was transferred to the Israelites, to these very early Israelites. The bull is also the symbol, of course, of Baal, the god, the main god of Canaan, and also of El, the chief god, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. But also is related to the Israelite gods, especially in the northern part of the country, the golden calves. They are the major symbols during the Israelite period. There is a lot of continuity between Canaanite and Israelite religion.
But there was one quite extraordinary cultural difference between the Israelites and their neighbors.
There are no bones of pigs in the Iron One sites of the highlands. The question is why? After all, there's no problem to raise pigs in the highlands. In the Bronze Age, they did have pigs in the highlands. So it has nothing to do with the environment or something like that. There are several reasons, possible reasons. One is that if these people came from pastoral background, of course, the pastoral people do not have pigs, and this could have been one of the reasons. But I think that there is a stronger reason to the fact that there are no bones of pigs in the highlands, and that is that at the same time exactly you have the sites of the Philistines in the lowlands, and in general the sites in the lowlands, Canaanites, Philistines and others, they eat a lot of pork. So the distinction between the people of the lowlands and the people of the highlands could have been a situation of we and they. They eat pork, we don't. This is how we form our identity. This could have been the reason.
Whatever the reason, the Jewish prohibition on eating pork continues a tradition which goes back 3,000 years to the highlands of Canaan. As time passed, the southern kingdom of Judah slowly became more densely populated, and agricultural development slowly increased. By the 8th century BC, Judah, like Israel in the north, was also becoming a developed state with all the panoply of administration and bureaucracy. Literacy was the vital precondition, and pottery remnants of the period testify to this key development.
The one that I have in my hands is the typical Judahite seal impression. It has an emblem, apparently the emblem of the kingdom, the emblem of the king in the center. And then it says, belonging to the king, Hebron. It doesn't mean that the king was sitting in Hebron. It means that either the tax was collected there at Hebron, or that the vessels were produced there, the standardized vessels of the kingdom.
The development of Judah was extremely fortunate, for just as it was becoming a proper state, Israel in the north was facing a mortal threat.
After the 9th century, the period of greatness of the Kingdom of Israel, in the 8th century, decline sets in because of the pressure from the north. The Arameans, the Assyrians move down. Eventually, in 732, they take the Galilee, and that's the beginning of the end of the Kingdom of Israel.
One by one, the northern cities were overrun, and bit by bit, the kingdom expired. Thus ended a state called Israel. It was to be 2,700 years before another state bearing that name would arise again in the Middle East. But Judah survived. According to the archaeology, large numbers of people now began arriving in the Judahite capital, Jerusalem. About 10,000 people suddenly descended on the city in the late 8th century. They were almost certainly the people of Israel.
Judah of the late 8th century was not at all similar to Judah of 30 or 40 years before. And that was because of the torrent of refugees who came from the north after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, came to Judah and settled here. Judah was completely transformed from a small, sleepy kingdom to one of the most influential kingdoms in the Levant. And that is the first time that we see a real, full-blown state in Judah.
These are the ruins of Lachish, Judah's second city. In 701 BC, after overrunning the northern kingdom of Israel, the Assyrians came south and began to attack Judah, then ruled by an important king called Hezekiah. As both the Bible and Assyrian records testify, the Assyrians razed the city to the ground after a prolonged siege.
Lachish was built probably in the 9th century. We don't have inscriptions, so we don't have a date. As a fortress city, it became the second important city of the kingdom of Judah after Jerusalem. This palace stood in the center of the site, and it was surrounded by very massive city walls and very massive city gate where we are standing now, and it became the most important fort in Judah after, of course, Jerusalem.
Now, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them.
The attack on Judah is well documented in this Assyrian relief, which records the assault on Lachish. It shows the use of a specially constructed rampart, which is still visible today.
The Assyrians came here and they wanted to force their way through the wall, which was high up on the slope. So the system was very simple. They dumped here stones, natural stones, which they took from all over the fields. Then they covered it with cement because soldiers cannot walk on stones. And on top of it, they built a platform of earth on which the battering rams stood and from which they could attack directly the wall, and they could climb the wall and go inside.
The Assyrian attacks put considerable pressure on the Judahite capital, Jerusalem. Added to the refugees from the north, people from the surrounding countryside also fled there for protection. In ancient times, people had come here to draw water from deep underground. But because of the terrain, the thousands now living in the city couldn't all get access.
We are now at the spring of Gihon, the source which comes out here from a crack in the rock and is emanating all the year round. This is a permanent source of water, and this is the raison d'etre of this village, which turned later, much later, into a city. Wouldn't it be for the water, nobody would have come to this place.
But we know, we understand, I think, the broader situation here. In the time of Hezekiah, Jerusalem grew all of a sudden and became a huge city, 10 times bigger than 50 years before him.
To bring water to the new population of the extended city, King Hezekiah now embarked on an extraordinary project, tunneling through 1/2 kilometer of rock.
The tunnel goes from here for over 500 meters, cut from both sides. They met in the middle, all in the rock.
Well, this is a real engineering achievement, and we still don't have an adequate explanation how this was done.
So the building of the tunnel, which came out here, also shows the increasing sophistication of the kingdom, emphasized by the fact that Hezekiah chose to record his feat for posterity.
This ancient Hebrew inscription is really one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for the rise of Judah as a kingdom. It's dated to the time of King Hezekiah at the end of the 8th century BC, and it records the cutting of the long, complicated Siloam tunnel that brought water to the city. So it represents both the engineering that was possible by the kingdom and also the attempt of the kingdom to record that act in an official way, in an official inscription. And so this really brings us to a time when the kingdom was centralized, when Jerusalem was a city that was administered by royal officials that had the power and the level of literacy to record their achievements and their history.
Literacy also played a key role in the politics of Judah. Judah was under siege. The northern Israelites had fled south en masse. Hezekiah had to hold the kingdom together. It seems his priests collected the slightly different northern and southern versions of Israelite history, and also wrote a new one to try to reconcile and unify the two traditions. These various texts were later to become part of what we know as the Old Testament. Hezekiah's situation would explain the importance of portraying David and Solomon as having once presided over an empire of all Israelites, based in Jerusalem. To promote unification, it seems Judah also now underwent a major religious purge. It appears worship began to be centralized in the capital. Half a millennium after the supposed time of Moses, this was the real beginning of monotheism, the belief in one God alone. The biblical account of Hezekiah's purge, more reliable because it was closer to the events, describes the destruction of idolatrous shrines.
And Hezekiah did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. He removed the high places and brake the images.
Well, we are sitting within the fortress of Arad, first of all. It's not a big fortress. It's only about 50 on 50 meters, that's all. Surrounded by a big wall, and inside there is the most important find at this site, and one of the most important finds all over Judah in biblical times, the temple, which is right here behind us. This temple was probably constructed sometime in the beginning of the 8th century BC and lasted throughout the 8th century BC. It was then destroyed, and this reminds us of other sites in the Beersheba Valley, in Judah and in the north also, where you have cessation of cult places, countryside cult places, before the end of the Iron Age. And apparently there was some sort of centralization of cult as part of the growing power of the capital and the administration and the king and the centralized government in Jerusalem in the late 8th century.
The new centralized cult in Jerusalem was focused on a special local Israelite deity, probably as a way of rallying people behind the king and getting them to identify with the state. That deity was called Yahweh. We know him from the Bible as Jehovah, or more simply, God.
The name Yahweh is a name of an Israelite. God relating to Israel appears for the first time in the inscriptions of around 800 BC, found in the Sinai desert. And one of the inscriptions is a dedication to Yahweh and his Asherah. That means Yahweh, the God of Israel, in this inscription has a consort, a wife, called Asherah, just like the main god of the Canaanites. So you can see at 800 BC, the Israelite religion was not yet the fully developed monotheism as we have it in the biblical tradition.
Asherahs, female deities like these, emphasized fertility and maternity. Despite the developing cult of Yahweh, the population of Judah continued to flirt with polytheism long after Hezekiah's purge. After the siege of Lachish, Judah, now revolving largely around Jerusalem, sued for peace with Assyria. Over the next century, there was a period of calm. The stability led to growth and prosperity. By the late 7th century, Assyria had withdrawn from Judah. Hezekiah's great-grandson Josiah now appears to have begun developing ideas of expanding Judah. To rally his population behind him, he redoubled and intensified the centralization of worship around Yahweh.
In order to achieve the ideas of extension, territorial extension, and so on, Josiah needed centralization of power, strong administration, complete control of the state. One way to do that was to centralize cult, to do this reform of cult, which would lead back to the idea, to the pan-Israelite idea, that all Israelites must worship one God, that is the God of Israel, in one capital, that is Jerusalem, in one temple, that is the temple of the God of Israel, under one monarch, one king, the king of the lineage of David. That was the pan-Israelite idea, which came into being in the 7th century BC.
At this time, Josiah's priests are said to have discovered a lost text which greatly emphasized the worship of Yahweh. They called it the Book of Law. It was almost certainly the Old Testament book that became known as Deuteronomy.
The book of Deuteronomy perpetrates one of the great reformations in history. It imposes a strict philosophical monotheism that banishes all other gods from traditional culture. This was part of a reformationist program in which King Josiah attempted to centralize not only power, but the ability to reach the realm of the divine into his own hands in Jerusalem, in the temple which sat in the backyard of the royal palace.
So somebody, a person or a group, sat down at that time and wrote the early core of the story. And the story serves Judah. It puts Judah in the center of the universe.
Deuteronomy was hugely important for Western civilization because for the first time, the individual was singled out from the crowd as the focus of moral responsibility and duties. Baruch Halpern believes this was actually connected to the earlier Assyrian attacks on Judah.
Many elements of the reform actually precede the reform. They're the result of the exile of the rural population of Judah in 701 BC by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. The extended family essentially disappears from the landscape of Judah in the 7th century after 701 BC. We no longer have compounds housing extended families. We have individual houses. We no longer have collective tombs containing hundreds of people being buried together. We no longer have large cooking pots. We no longer have large ovens. All these things shrink down in size, as they do in other cultures when the extended family disappears and the nuclear family becomes the center of organization and identity. Effectively, what you see in the 7th century BC is the development of individuality.
These social changes were reflected in radical new laws in Deuteronomy. An ideological change of great enduring consequence.
There's something else about Deuteronomy which is remarkable, and this is what we can call today the ideas of civil rights, of rights of the individual, of the person. I mean, Deuteronomy is full of ideas how to protect women, children, slaves, people who lose their land, the simple people. It was probably one of the ways to attempt to mobilize the people of Judah behind the ideas of the new reforms, because they give them, the rights, if you wish, for the first time.
This pottery fragment from Josiah's time records a petition from an unknown agricultural labourer against his local commander.
What it testifies to is a new consciousness at the end of the 7th century, in the time of King Josiah, even among simple agricultural workers, that the power of the governor was subject to some greater laws, some greater morality. And it's here on this broken piece of pottery, as archaeological evidence from the time of Josiah, that what we now still believe as biblical tradition and biblical morality was born among the people in the fields of ancient Judah at the end of the 7th century BC.
What you have here is a case of the rejection of tradition. It's not the invention of tradition, it is the rejection of tradition. And that is the mindset, the self-conscious mindset on which science and monotheism and Western civilization have been founded.
Despite Josiah's confidence, his ambitions were soon thwarted. In 609 BC, here at Megiddo, Josiah was killed by Egyptians in uncertain circumstances. He was still a young man, his dream of a great new Israelite empire smashed. It seemed a terminal disaster for the Israelites, and this catastrophe has been immortalized in the biblical name for Megiddo, Armageddon. But Armageddon was not the end. The Israelites' greatest achievement was yet to come. The death of Josiah in 609 BC at the hands of the Egyptians seemed the end of all Judah's hopes.
And now everything is ruined. The Egyptians have power over the country. In the east, Babylon becomes a great power, and they have power over the country. Things continue to go worse to worse. And first there are 3 different sons and 1 grandson of Josiah who get to be the king. And finally, the last one of them is King Zedekiah. The Babylonians come under the great emperor Nebuchadnezzar. They surround Jerusalem. They defeat it. They march out all of Zedekiah's sons, and they execute them one by one in front of him, and then they put out his eyes, and they put him in chains, and they take him back to Babylon.
And Nebuchadnezzar carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives.
With the elite of Judah removed to Babylon and Jerusalem devastated, the kingdom was destroyed, and the remnants of the population left scattered and leaderless. But the Judahites taken to Babylon managed to preserve the memory of their religion and history. Jerusalem, or Zion, remained central to their thoughts.
It was a complete catastrophe. It could have been the end. So it's really interesting that at that time, the only hope, the only way to keep the identity and the tradition was around, the old stories.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion.
But in fact, the Judahites' exile didn't last long. Within 60 years, the first of them began returning to Jerusalem.
The Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, and under the Persians, the Jews were allowed to return, rebuild their temple, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild their country, under the Persians.
We are now in post-exilic times, in the 5th century BC or immediately thereafter. There is no king, there is no dynasty. Judah is not independent. We are speaking about the community of Yehud under the Persian Empire. The needs are very different. The situation is completely different than before.
The Judahites, or Jews as they now became known, were led by priests, and one of them played an absolutely critical role in the history of the Bible. This priest gathered together the various Jewish texts which were still remembered and put them into an official compilation, known as the Torah. Richard Friedman believes this priest was called Ezra.
He's a priest, he's a scribe, he has access to the texts, and he's someone who has power because he's someone who's strong enough to come to the Jews and say, okay, this is the Bible from now on, this is Torah. And he stands the people up and they hold a tremendous ceremony, and he has the priests stand up and read the text of the Torah. And that Torah that he created, the 5 books of Moses, is the Torah that everybody has read for 2,500 years since that time.
The year was 458 BC. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and in many ways its core, was later supplemented by further texts. These collective works have come down to us as the Old Testament. From their own complex and difficult history, the Israelites had wrought a document that is still influencing the world.
The Bible is, of course, the most important creation of the Israelites ever. It is the most wonderful and rich literary creation ever created. I think it's still the bestseller, isn't it? It's the best sold book until this very day.
It's this continuing influence, particularly in moral debates, that makes the Old Testament's reliability as history still a matter of importance. Professor Finkelstein and Neil Silberman have shown that not every story or word of the Old Testament can be literally true, and that as history it has to be carefully interpreted. But their objective is not to undermine or dismiss deeply held beliefs.
Despite all the controversy, what we are doing is creating that archaeological story that goes in parallel with the still very profound and cherished biblical tradition.
What we are trying to do, what we wish to do, is not to discard, the biblical text, but to make a distinction between tradition, which is important to all of us, and scientific research. This, I think, is a central piece in what we wish to do. Put this distinction between the two. Tradition is important. Archaeology cannot trash the tradition. Archaeology cannot destroy tradition, because tradition has life of itself.
We're not saying that one is correct and one is incorrect any more than we would say that the poetry of Genesis is incorrect now that we know a bit about human evolution. What we're doing is just continuing a struggle, a scholarly struggle that's been going on for 100 years. The boundary just now happens to be in the story of the Israelites and the Israelite kingdom. And it's moving forward slowly to separate religious literature and spirituality from what we call history.
Modern scholarship is showing then that the Old Testament was a human and highly partisan construct. This does not, however, take away its power or enduring moral force. Indeed, in many ways, it makes the achievement of those who wrote the Old Testament all the more remarkable.
Sometimes when I see how great it is that there was a source that pictured God as very heavenly and universal, and another pictured God as the God of your Father, very close and personal, but then they come together and you get a Bible about a God who is universal and also close. It's God who created the universe and God of your Father. To me, this is a great thing, but I still haven't really come to understand how it worked out so well. We're not talking about one author sitting down and designing something so it comes out nicely at the end. We're talking about 100, 150 authors in the whole Bible writing, and you get a story that flows and works so well and makes such sense and has consistency in it that to me that is, I hesitate to use the word, but a miracle.
The deep-sea detectives attempt to get to the bottom of a mysterious disappearance and a possible case of mass murder in the Mediterranean next.